So it's great. Well, good morning, Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. Thanks for coming along and talking to the Brisbane Stoics. Obviously, a lot of people will have maybe seen you on on the YouTube or listened to your podcasts, and you have a very interesting approach. So maybe just jump in. You probably told this story a lot of times, but can you say something about yourself and maybe what got you interested in Stoicism?
Yeah, I'm a currently a law enforcement officer. I'm a detective in a large agency here in Florida. That career will probably come to an end here real soon. I'm kind of aging out of it. So uh, I was introduced to Stoicism actually as a result of my law enforcement career. When I started in law enforcement, I was in a pretty rough part of our jurisdiction and exposed to some of the worst of human nature. And I was an atheist at the time, and I didn't have anything to kind of make sense of what I was observing, and the combination of that and the Nietzsche famously wrote that when you're battling monsters, you have to be careful not to become a monster yourself. And likewise, he wrote that when you stare into the abyss is also staring back. And I realized that was what I was doing on a day-to-day basis was taking a toll on my psyche. And so I started looking for something. And I was at the time I had been reading very broadly in areas of evolutionary psychology and consciousness studies, and some philosophy, but not really ancient philosophy. And then just coincidentally, I came across a book by Jonathan Haidt titled the Happiness Hypothesis, and he mentioned Stoicism in there. I thought, okay, I didn't know anything about it other than, the stiff upper lip kind of, suck it up buttercup stoicism that we're all taught and that I was kind of introduced to in the Marine Corps, but that's a different thing. So I started to do a little reading and became interested and found the College of Stoic Philosophers online, took their initial course, went on to their year-long Marcus Aurelius program, and that was in 2011, and have been a practicing Stoic and a mentor. And now I'm the scholar of the college, and then started the Traditional Stoic blog in 2015 and the podcast in 2018.
And I'd like to find out more about the college, the Stoic College. That's really interesting. Um, I guess also it's kind of interesting. It sounds like you already had the kind of philosophical bug to start with because you were a policeman or a detective, and you were already starting to think that you needed to look for something outside of the mainstream approaches for dealing with what you were seeing every day.
Yeah, I've been a lifelong learner, and I would call myself a lifelong seeker. Trying to find things that made life better for me. And I have been both a believing Christian and a hardcore atheist in my life. I didn't grow up with any particular religion; those were all adventures in my adult life. So I had a background in a variety of different things. And like I said, I studied took a couple of courses in ancient Greek philosophy, so I kind of understood the history and a little bit of the concepts, the progression from the pre-Socratics up through, at least Aristotle, not much beyond that. But in my consciousness studies, I read enough of Descartes because he's kind of a part of consciousness studies if you're going to study in that area, and and then evolutionary psychology was a whole different ball game in terms of trying to put all of that into the context of evolutionary biology, which is interesting. But then it all ties into sociology, which of course is the what do I say the generic field that criminology and law enforcement comes from, is trying to understand human behavior, which is always I've been curious about it ever since I was a child. What it is that makes humans tick, why people do the things that they do, and so yes.
So it must feel a bit like a progression. Like you started out asking questions, and Stoicism's come along after a long time. After it's a bit like a journey, and you've arrived at a spot where things are sort of making more sense. There's a clarity in Stoicism.
There is, and there's a middle ground. You know, it's interesting. I'd have to look at it now, but I think it was, well, let's see, I've been practicing Stoicism for 11 years. So prior to that, 20 years prior to that, back in about 1990, I started writing. I poetry's always been something I find myself both moved by and occasionally enjoy writing just for my own purposes. Not never had any poetry published beyond grade school, but I started writing a poem about my seeking and my frustration with not finding any answers in Christianity, not finding any answers in atheism, and that poem was a 20-year long process, and I watched it evolve until I finally found Stoicism. And the struggle I was faced with was that on the one hand, I had walked away from Christianity for specific reasons, became an atheist kind of because it was, I said that, the popular way of thinking in a secular age, and absorbed that, but ultimately realized that there's no meaning there. If you're really going to be an honest atheist, you have to admit to nihilism, because now people call themselves atheists and don't think about that. But a philosophically consistent atheist, there can't be any meaning in life other than what I create for myself, which is really just how I happen to feel and given my particular circumstances. But there's nothing to hang an ethical hat on to say, okay, well, this is why humans should behave the way they do. Of course, monotheistic religions provide us with that in the form of religious texts that give us a rule book. But in Stoicism, there was something different. There was this innate spirituality and connection with something that the Stoics considered divine, because it was a providentially ordered cosmos. But there wasn't a rule book. It was this is a path. This is a set of guidelines that lead you toward a state of excellent character, which is to bring about a state of well-being. But it's to some degree subjective, and I mean that in the sense that my what is an appropriate act for me in this particular day might be an inappropriate act for me tomorrow in a different set of circumstances. Where some people get hung up with deontological ethics, is that the rules are the rules are the rules, as Kant said. The law is fixed, and if you violate the law for any reason, even for what would be an otherwise good reason, you have violated the law, and that's an evil. The Stoics don't do that. They provide us with guidelines, and within those guidelines, you have to determine, as a responsible moral agent, what is the right thing to do.
Yeah,
Now,
it's
that
really
doesn't give you carte blanche of I get to do whatever I want to do because I can justify it. That's not what they meant.
Funnily too, I'm very attracted, as I've told you, to learning about psychotherapy. And recently I was reading about Viktor Frankl, who's the founder of logotherapy. And people often try to draw a kind of parallel or a connection between him and Stoicism. But one thing recently I was reading, he said that in his description of what meaning was, it was that in any particular concrete situation, any given now, you can ask yourself, what is the meaning for me in this particular situation? And then you can go about trying to bring out the most virtuous or the best outcome from any given particularity. And that, to me, that's the same sort of thing. It's kind of a similar stance to take, that instead of being lost in the future or having a rule book, every moment is a moment in which you get to find out what kind of character you have. And it's a very active process.
Yes. And it's much more difficult. I mean, it's nice. And I think as humans, I know I wanted a rule book. It would be nice if, when you're born, you're handed a book of rules to guide your life, right? That would be really easy, because in some sense it takes away all of our moral accountability, because all we have to do is follow the rules. But the Stoics, for Stoicism, it's not that simple. It's not that easy, because the truth is that the the circumstances around every situation are so varied and so
Mm,
complex that you can't make a rule that applies everywhere at all times. You just simply can't. I mean, there are some rules. I mean, but you look at, okay, thou shalt not murder. Okay, well, how about in defense of your family? Now we could say, well, that's not what murder is. Okay, but I'm still killing another human being who's potentially trying to kill my family. Is that wrong? And I could interpret "thou shalt not murder" in that way. Some religions do, and say, well, then I can't ever take another human life. That somehow is a mortal sin. So
mm,
that's applying a rule across the board, and you know, which interestingly carries over into my profession as law enforcement, because we have laws, that people have to obey, or there are consequences for not obeying them if they get caught. But at the same time, the law enforcement, a part of law enforcement, is well, good law enforcement is learning to apply those rules in a fair and judicious way, and meaning understanding that in this particular circumstance, someone might be in violation of the letter of the law, but that doesn't mean that in that particular circumstance they deserve to be arrested and go to jail because the letter of the law says X. And so there's a level of discernment there on the part of a law enforcement officer to apply those laws at the front end. Obviously, there's a whole judicial system behind that determines, whether the law enforcement officer's judgment was correct and so forth. That's that system. But the initial contact puts a heavy burden on the law enforcement officer to determine whether this is a case where I need to use my authority to take someone's rights away temporarily and place them in my custody.
what particular aspect of Stoicism kind of really jumps out at you? Because I've found for me there's a particular aspect. Is there a particular aspect for you?
Well, a particular aspect, I mean, ironically, anybody who's followed my path online would probably think, and rightfully so, that it was the concept of providence, but they would think so for the wrong reasons, because um, I came to Stoicism as an atheist. I went through the initial training program, the SES program at the college, Stoic Essential Studies, as an atheist. Went into the Marcus Aurelius program as an atheist, made it through the logic term, and was in the middle of the physics term when I was finally confronted with the Stoic concept of providence and logos and divinity, and um, really struggled, because I reached a point where I thought, okay, I either have to come to grips with this and be able to understand this, or I have to walk away from Stoicism, because it was clear to me that it was inseparable from Stoicism. Stoicism is so integrated with its physics that you can't just, like some want to say, yank that worldview out and still have anything remotely resembling what the ancient Stoics were teaching. So I struggled very, very long and hard with the concept of providence until I finally was okay with it. And then my one of my very first papers was a paper titled "Providence or Atoms." That was published in Stoicism Today, Volume 2, and but that was kind of the outburst from that struggle. So that's what jumped out at me. But ironically, it jumped out at me because it was the thing I struggled against so much, and did not want to be there in Stoicism. Like a lot of modern Stoics, I did not want that stuff in Stoicism. I wanted it for different reasons. But at the same, I had to be intellectually honest, and I could not say, well, I can just toss this out and it's still essentially the same. So I made the choice to, what Pierre Hadot calls an existential choice, to assent to the concept of a providentially ordered cosmos, which is not, you know, unscientific or unsupportable in modern times, as one of the big name Stoics in the modern community likes to assert. It is quite understandable in light of truly modern science, which is a modern science that has uh, brought itself in line with things like quantum physics and modern consciousness studies, as opposed to the, what is still referred to often as modern science, but is really, late 19th, early 20th century science and a mechanistic, reductive, materialist concept of the cosmos. I think the one thing that is true is that that worldview is dying. It's gasping its last breaths because the people who have promoted it for a century are dying. You know, as Kuhn points out in his book on scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts, changes don't occur in science, unfortunately, because someone presents a great idea and people accept it. Change occurs in science because the people who held the old idea die off, and the new idea is in a new generation of thinkers who are willing to consider that idea. Because the older generation, the generation that's been there their entire career, the books they've written, it depends upon that old paradigm. So they're not just going to give that up. So that's what we see today. We see a lot of the scientists, they're not going to give up that, what is considered that modern scientific worldview, because their whole career has been, their education, their career is based upon it. So they have to, like, unfortunately, Einstein did. You know, he doubted, he wanted so badly to deny quantum physics. You know, quote, God doesn't play dice, and he just could not accept a probabilistic universe. And until he was, you know, finally forced to admit that, yeah, he was wrong, and that somehow, but then still held on to the hope that somehow, someday, we would develop the science that would prove that quantum physics doesn't really mean what the initial founders just thought that it meant. When in fact the exact opposite is true. The more they test it, the more they experiment. Excuse me. It's the beginning of allergy season here in Florida, so I'm going to get a little bit of stuff running down my throat. But the more we experiment with quantum physics, the more we realize things that are true, that are consistent with Stoicism, that everything in the world is somehow connected in a way that we can't possibly understand. So that, you know, it's in Stoic, in quantum physical terms, there's an entanglement that exists, which means that there's an entanglement that exists somehow between all particles. Otherwise, how do we explain how particles can somehow communicate and relate to one another when separated by large distances, and they're communicating in ways that are faster than the speed of light? Well, that old mechanistic conception of the world can't account for that. It also can't account for things like human consciousness, which is why we're starting to see the evolution of things like Panpsychism, where the leading edge thinkers are saying, yeah, materialism just does not get us to a conception of human consciousness, and consciousness has to be in some way a fundamental aspect of reality, which is, again, getting us very close to Stoicism, right?
Right. It's really interesting. You've obviously come via the way of panpsychism and modern science, quantum science, if you like. I've been reading a little bit around phenomenology, which is an alternative to the analytic tradition, and they have a different set of language about this too. But you know, it's a very similar conception that you can't take the person out of the world, that we're embedded in the world, we grow out of the world, that the world is meaningful for us, and we can't ever tease the two apart. It's fascinating, and I guess that's the point. Like a lot of people in the groups that I've met that call themselves Stoics, or we might think of as modern Stoics, think that, and maybe just, you know, well, they think that this Stoicism that they've come across will support their, what's the word, basic understanding of mechanistic science. But in fact, when you start to talk about providence in that, they tend to get quite turned off and maybe a little bit dissatisfied with where the conversation's going, because it's not going in the direction or supporting the assumptions that they kind of want to, you know, keep valid and keep validating. In that regard, I guess I'm going to say, so talking about panpsychism or quantum theory or phenomenology as different expressions of the cosmos as a whole, do you think that would help to clarify for the modern audience what is meant by this very vague and kind of cloudy term, providence? Is that the kind of thing that we should be
Yes.
thinking to help to educate people that we're not talking about witchcraft, for example, or Christianity?
Yes. Well, and interestingly, now that I'm the scholar at the College of Stoic Philosophers, I'm going to be re-implementing. When I went through the program, we quantum physics was a part of the program. So there was a textbook you had to read. It's not meant for you to understand quantum physics because that's way beyond my intellectual capabilities. I don't have the math to be able to even come remotely close to understanding quantum physics, but to understand the concepts like entanglement and the idea that the cosmos is really probabilistic rather than mechanistic. But that is important to understand. The biggest hurdle that moderns have to get over, though, with things like providence is the language itself, because most moderns, the only time they've come into contact with a word like providence might have been in Sunday school or in reading, a history book where, George Washington, if you're American, George Washington thought that, God was on his side in some providential way as he fought against the British, or that the North and the South each thought that God was on their side in some providential way. And so that, rightfully so, is a turnoff for a modern who thinks that that's what the Stoics meant by it. When they come across a word like logos, their only concept, or the only time they may have heard that is, that's from the Bible. In the beginning was the word, logos, and the word was with God, and the word was God. That Jesus was logos. So the first thing they have to do is set aside the religious definitions of those terms and understand that providence, that's not what it meant. And Stoic providence is not the same as Christian providence in the sense that there's a God up in heaven who's moving pieces around on a chessboard and that you can pray to, and that on this particular day when your car is on a collision course with another car in an intersection, that somehow God works some kind of miracle and allows you to escape the crash. That's not Stoic providence. But Stoic providence is nonetheless teleology, the idea that there is a goal directedness to the cosmos and that the cosmos has a purpose of its own. One of my Stoic podcasts, I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Tim Mulgan, who in fact is over there in your part of the world. I can't remember if he's I think he's a New Zealander. I think you call them Kiwis, right? Isn't that the correct term for New Zealander? I think he's a Kiwi, not an Aussie. But he wrote a book called Purpose in the Cosmos, a subtitle, An Anthropocentric Purposivism. The concept being that he is a consequentialist ethicist at the University of Auckland, and his argument is that without purpose, if there is no inherent purpose in the cosmos, then we have nothing to hang our ethics on. We can't begin to argue that there should be some form of universal ethics without some purpose in the cosmos. And he goes on to argue that that purpose in the cosmos is likely or may be not the purpose of human beings. In other words, it has a purpose of its own, which to some degree the Stoics agreed with. In other words, the Stoics would go as far as to say that what the cosmos does may not benefit you, Courtney, or me, Chris, in any particular situation, because it's benefiting the cosmos as a whole. And you may be, wounded, harmed, killed in the process of something that benefits the cosmos as a whole. So that's why, from the traditional Stoic perspective, when you view things from the cosmic viewpoint, you have to accept that the cosmic viewpoint is something bigger than I am. That this is not just about me, which of course is something very hard for most moderns, in a me generation and an I generation, to accept that everything in the world is not about me. But Stoicism does not teach that.
Fascinating. And probably a year ago, I read Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire, for example, and she sets out her argument. At the beginning, she says there's kind of three ways in which the Hellenistic schools kind of developed. On the one hand, and she's saying I'm just wondering if there's a similarity with what you're expressing there and with what she calls the Platonic doctor versus, say, on the other extreme, the more Aristotelian version, which is the common conception of what the ordinary people think of as good, for example. And then she tries to put the Stoics into some middle path that she calls the medical analogy, for example. And the interesting thing is she's saying, if we take the Platonic side, and obviously the Stoics are inheriting part of this Platonic intellectual furniture, it's this idea that if you climb up the ladder and you view things the way that they are in the world of the ideal forms, you'll see that maybe the good, or maybe the beautiful, maybe the pure form has no relationship to what the human being needs or wants for itself. But she's going to go a little bit further and say, well, the Stoics might have that particular view, but on the other hand, they also think that human nature has been taken into account in some way by the cosmos. I mean, what do you think of that? As opposed to saying something like the universe has its own designs and we don't fit into it, and maybe it's completely inimical, for example, to what is for the average human being. Is there another way where like maybe thinking about what she's saying there, that what is actually good for us is also identical with what is good for the cosmos?
Well, yeah, and that is a key differentiator between Stoicism and Platonism, and even with Tim Mulligan's approach. Tim Mulligan leaves open the possibility that the cosmos may be benevolent toward humankind, but his argument is that it doesn't have to be in order for it to have a purpose and for us to ground our ethics in it. Now, from a Stoic perspective, in Stoicism, our reason, our human reason, is derived from universal reason. So we are, in a sense, a fragment of the whole. Each one of us is, which is why you see both Seneca and Epictetus say, you have a God within. We have a fragment of God within us, and which ultimately leads to the Stoic doctrine of living in agreement with nature, which is cosmic nature. So we have, and ultimately that means living in agreement with human nature and cosmic nature, and in the third aspect, your own individual nature. So each one of us is a little bit different. You and I are not identical. We weren't created identical. So we have, well, in fact, my next episode of my podcast, I'm talking about, the different roles that we may have in the same play. We serve different purposes. We're not all the same. This idea of equality in modern times is ridiculous. We're equal in the sense that we're all born with reason, and we all have the same capability, barring some kind of medical issue at birth, to develop virtue and experience well-being. But we're not the same. We weren't intended to be the same, and we're not intended to have the same outcome. But in Stoicism, in a sense, we are part of the cosmos. So if you were to make the argument that the cosmos was not benevolent to humankind in Stoicism, you would be simultaneously making the argument that the cosmos has not been benevolent to itself, which would be kind of ridiculous, right?
Yes.
Or counterintuitive.
And for me, my particular interest is in Stoicism as a kind of therapy. I'm not trying to separate therapy from Stoicism, but it's right there, right? That when we step outside of what is good for the cosmos, we also step outside of what is good for us in some very basic, fundamental way. And so as a therapy, and this is like Nussbaum's argument, she's saying that the expert doctor image of the Stoic teacher is to say this person has a disease because he's living outside of what nature has designed for us as human beings. And therefore we need to create medicines. We need to find ways to bring this person back in accord with nature, in accord with what is the good. And I think that, for me, I find that a really relevant project, because you look around yourself and you look at rampant consumerism and depression and anxiety and meaninglessness and suicide and drug abuse and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, like, for me, I feel like Stoicism has a lot to do, a lot of really, it has something very basic to say about the human condition, that what is good for me is good for the cosmos, that I might have been misled, that I might be following a path that's fundamentally harmful to me and to humanity. So
Yeah.
I bring that up because I think, that definitely is an important feature. And I guess it drives me to want to know more about Stoicism. And so I'd ask you, you've kind of become a kind of a leader in a part of the Stoic community, whether you want to be or not. What do you see as your mission in that regard?
Well, I say quite honestly, my mission is to keep alive, which is what I say open my podcast with, is to keep the concept of Stoicism as a rational philosophy and spiritual way of life. So it's um, the direction of modern Stoicism is to remove all of that, or to redefine it in a way that it becomes meaningless. So my my mission has been from day one to say, no, 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 wait, okay, that's fine. You guys can go over there and create an agnostic slash atheist version of Stoicism. Just please be honest about what you're doing, but leave this version of Stoicism as the Stoics conceived it alone, because it is still viable, even though you don't want to believe that it's viable. Because they look at modern Stoicism and they say, well, yeah, that God stuff, that logo stuff, that providence stuff, that has to be stripped out because it disagrees with modern science. And they do that mistakenly because A, they don't understand Stoicism, and B, they don't even understand modern science. But that's what they've been taught. That's what they've been told. They've absorbed a worldview from the zeitgeist of a modern secular age that they don't even, it's a fish in water. They don't even know that they're in water because that's all that they know. But you're in a different body of water and you can't see. There was a gentleman on one of the other Stoic podcasts recently who said, he's had a podcast for years, but said, I've read these Stoic texts and somehow I missed all of these times when they're talking about God and logos and providence. And as someone who's interested in human psychology, you're quite aware of the human ability to deceive ourselves, to have such a cognitive bias against something that you literally can't even see what's right in front of you. So the reason why I am so convinced that providence is an essential part of Stoicism it goes back to the beginning part of this conversation. I didn't want it to be there. I wanted so badly. The first book I read on Stoicism was Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism. I thought, oh, this is great. And then I read Irvine's book, The Good Life, Guide to the Good Life, both of which are purely secular. I thought, okay, all right, this is good. Unfortunately, as I got into the texts, and then more importantly, the scholarship on those texts, I realized, okay, yeah, this doesn't work. You can't just remove this stuff and have Stoicism remain intact. So, yeah, I would say my mission is not to say modern Stoicism is wrong, because let's face it, you can evolve anything. I could invent Chris Fisher Stoicism. And how could you arguably say I'm wrong? If I say it's Chris Fisher's version of Stoicism, and I'm going to completely diverge from the way the ancients conceived it, you can't say I'm wrong. You could say, well, yeah, I can disagree with that it's actually Stoicism. I can take some of the points of your philosophy and may argue against them, but that it's wrong or immoral or unethical. No, you can't make that argument, because I'm just creating a new philosophy. And in a sense, that's what modern Stoics have done. They've just created a new philosophy, but unfortunately, that's not the way it's presented. It's presented as a natural evolution of ancient Stoicism. Yeah. Or, some people will argue that, well, if the Stoics if we had a continuous tradition of Stoicism, it would have naturally evolved into agnosticism or atheism. That's just bunk. And in fact, I think a more legitimate argument could be made that if it had continued to exist as a tradition, it likely would have evolved into Christianity far more than it would have evolved into agnosticism or Stoicism, because the tradition of Stoicism is toward theism, not away from. Which is why we see in Epictetus, already the language of theism. God as Father. He wasn't a theist, but he was getting awfully darn close to theism in his language. And it's not a big step to say, well, they might have become Christians or some kind of Neoplatonists with, like Plotinus, and take on some of that kind of spirituality. But they weren't heading toward atheism or agnosticism. So again, I would say my mission is to try to keep ancient Stoicism, which in modern times has become called traditional Stoicism, only because up until the turn of the century, Stoicism was Stoicism. You didn't need to differentiate. And the modern Stoics, while they like to say that traditional Stoics broke away from them, the truth is they broke away from Stoicism, because the organization known as New Stoa and the College of Stoic Philosophers existed before the modern Stoic movement was even conceived of. So they came into existence after Eric Weigart created the New Stoa and founded the College of Stoic Philosophers. And then, the modern Stoics came in and took over. And I'm just trying to say, hey, do what you want to do, but leave this ancient version of Stoicism alone, please.
Yeah, that's really good. And actually, you say something really interesting there. As I feel like I'm progressing, the more I read the original text, for example, the more I have these horrific moments where I go, oh my God, because I used to hate Christianity. Like I used to loathe it in my bones. And sometimes I'm just struck by this overwhelming similarity at times, like the inner God within is almost like the Holy Spirit, and there's various kind of things that just jump out of you, especially the more you start to pay attention to providence and those very religious feeling parts of Stoicism. So I guess that makes me kind of think, and I've heard this in the context of Hadot saying that philosophy as a way of life can be very disruptive. It can be a kind of conversion experience. It can kind of radically change the individual in some very fundamental ways. So do you think, was it for you quite a disruptive experience, maybe psychologically, but maybe even socially? Was it a disruptive experience to sort of come to a deeper understanding of Stoicism?
No, not socially or psychologically, because I think there was a I don't know how to describe it, but my very nature, just who I am as a person, I think I was destined to be a Stoic. That's just kind of the mindset that I developed in childhood, and it was just a natural fit for me. So there wasn't a lot of disruption, and socially, I wasn't involved in anything that would have, taken me. I didn't drink. I didn't hang out at bars. I didn't, wasn't out. I've been married for 25 years, so I wasn't out. Womanized. I wasn't doing things that all of a sudden I decided, okay, well, I need to clean up my act. I was living a lifestyle that didn't require a lot of change there. What it did require, it was a lot of internal change, but that wasn't necessarily disruptive to my external life. It just required me to sit down and recognize that some of the thoughts and beliefs that I was carrying, which caused me, internal pain and angst, were things that I needed to change. I needed to look at the world in a different way, and the conversion change for me was assenting to a providential cosmos. Because as soon as I made that decision, that existential leap, the world changed for me, because suddenly things that in my past that I thought, oh, that was tragic, that was horrible, that was, something that I regret or whatever. Now I could look at them in a different light. And, in my paper, Providence or Atoms, I talk about, if we look at, use the analogy of our tapestry of our life, And, those, likened them to the red threads, the horrific times. I had been through a divorce. I'd been through some tragedy in my childhood. Now they were a piece of who I was. And, and looking back, I can see how they molded me and shaped me, not in good ways, because I overcame them and, I learned from them. So everything took on a different meaning that wasn't there before. And I think that's the power of providence, because we live in a time when worldwide, not just in America, but worldwide, even you look at the most impoverished nations in the world, they're still better than people lived in America just a couple hundred years ago. We are more prosperous as a race. We are more connected as a race. We have more free time, and especially in the West. And yet people are more just as dissatisfied and angry and hostile as they ever were. So it's not about materialism and making life easier for us in having modern conveniences and cars and jewelry and big houses and all of that. That obviously doesn't bring happiness. And I had my own experience with that, because I was born into a life of literal abject poverty. I mean, the kind of poverty that doesn't really even exist even in America today. It was the kind of poverty that was rare even when I was a child, but I lived in that. My grandmother raised me, didn't even have a back door on her house, and her house was such a dilapidated shack that when she died, the fire department came in and burned it to the ground as a fire drill for practice for the fire department to put the flames out. So that's what I grew up in. I didn't know any better, but once I got into adolescence a little bit more, and then I had this ambition to be successful, and success meant not living like that. Success meant having some material success. And I reached a point before I came into law enforcement where I had reached a high degree of monetary success, only to realize, as Stephen Covey famously said, a lot of people spend their whole life climbing the ladder of success only to get to the top rung and realize I'm on the wrong ladder. And that was the realization that I had. As I was driving into the community I lived in, which was an elite gated guarded community, and at that time my Mercedes Benz, and I looked around and I thought, this is not me. This is not who I am at my core. And abandoned it all and went into law enforcement and back into public service. So those things don't provide us with meaning. We think they do. We want them to, but why else do you see? People talk about. I had this conversation the other day with another gentleman on a podcast, and we tend to look at fate or fortune in a negative light. In other words, fate has been bad to me. Fate has been really good to me. We oftentimes don't realize that sometimes the things that we might look at as the most fortuitous can be the worst things for us. As an example, here in America, the people who hit the mega lottery, you think, oh, they're set for life. And yet you read the horror stories about these people, their lives fall apart, their marriages fall apart, their families are fighting over the wealth. It's not a panacea. So all of that means that any meaning, any value to true human existence is inside. It's not out there in the externals. And that's where Stoicism departs even from Aristotelianism, which said that you had to have some of those things, or Epicureanism that said, well, some of those things are nice. We want to, live in the garden and remove ourselves from the hostilities of civil life so that we can experience, a peaceful, pleasurable life. But Stoicism allows us to live in the midst of all of that, in the midst of all of the tumult that exists in everyday life, and still not be touched by it, or not be internally touched by it.
You were talking about providence just previously, and I remember reading an article by a fellow called Woollen, and he talks about right at the last section of his article, which is on Stoicism as a preliminary cognitive behavioral therapy. He says, if we do all these things and we follow this kind of secular way of thinking about it, and we do Stoicism in a kind of cognitive behavioral kind of fashion, sure, we might be able to get rid of a lot of these distortions or anxieties or like problems in negative thinking. And then but he sort of concludes at the end and he says, but it makes me wonder, like if we take providence out of the picture, is it really possible that we can achieve the kind of claims that the Stoics make in the literature? Like when your child dies and you realize, well, no, it was just loaned to me. It wasn't mine to keep. You can't actually achieve that if you have a modern Stoicism that's got the providential picture removed from it. You can't actually get to that teleological kind of ending that's kind of implied with the right kind of attitude, with the right kind of understanding of what the universe is. So I was going to ask you, really, do you think that if you remove providence from the picture, do you agree there with Woollen and that you really disempower the whole philosophical project? What's left is a very I don't know, a far less transformational and a far less effective form of philosophy as a way of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And even beyond, I'm sorry, what was the person's name you read? I haven't heard.
Woollen,
Spell that?
WOOLL there. I think it's called
Okay.
Stoicism as a preliminary psychotherapy, something like that.
Okay. Well, it sounds like he's spot on, and he's in complete agreement with, no less than Anthony Long, who I consider, if not the preeminent scholar of Stoicism, certainly among the maybe three preeminent scholars of Stoicism in the world today. Maybe to include people like Christopher Gill, David Sedley, uh, Brad Edenwood, maybe, but Long makes the argument, I think very powerfully, that not only do you disempower Stoicism when you remove providence, in fact, he likens it to a cosmic theology that's necessary as an underpinning for Stoic ethics. But he points out the fact that, as you just mentioned, some of the things that the Stoics teach can't even possibly make sense. They are so counterintuitive once you remove the cosmic or the Stoic worldview out of Stoicism. So we have to abandon major portions of Stoicism in order to, if we're going to remove the concepts of providence, the physics, and the theology. And yeah, absolutely, it turns it into something quite different. Now, my position has been what it gets turned into might prove to be very effective. We don't know yet, right? Modern Stoicism, because the one interesting thing about modern Stoicism is try to find a definition of modern Stoicism.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. They all disagree with one another about what it is. So there really is no, modern Stoicism. There's a bunch of modern Stoics, all with their own ideas. So will it work? Might it produce some type of well-being through the achievement of some definition of moral excellence that is somewhat different from the Stoics? Yeah, it's possible that it might work, but arguably it's not Stoicism. It's something different. It's maybe a modified version of Stoicism, but it's not Stoicism in the way that the ancients understood it, taught it, practiced it, and fought so hard against their enemies to keep together, because they struggled even in their time to argue that no, you cannot disassemble this. You cannot take Stoicism apart and have it remain the same. That if you remove even one piece, Cato in Cicero's writings, he has Cato say that if you remove even, I can't remember now, it's one word or one letter, the whole thing falls apart. Now he's making a grandiose statement there, kind of a polarizing statement, but he's trying to make a point. You can't disassemble Stoicism and have the whole remain the same, which is why the Stoics offered the similes that they did, the egg, the animal, and the orchard. Stoicism never said, or the ancient Stoics never said, well, Stoicism is like a house with a foundation and walls and a roof. Or Stoicism is like a bridge with piers and a road going over it. Or Stoicism is like an arch with a keystone. No, they picked what? They picked three organisms, living organisms, that if you remove any portion of any one of those living organisms, it won't survive. The animal can't survive without its soul. The egg is not an egg without its yolk, and you can't have an orchard without the trees and the soil. If you remove those, you've destroyed the organism. So they intentionally picked organisms to liken their system of logic, physics, and ethics to help them make the argument that, yeah, you can't separate these. And in fact, in the Middle Stoa, and I can't remember off the top of my head if it was Panaetius or Posidonius, he objected to, and a lot of people like to point to him, to the Middle Stoics, oh yeah, they were a different breed of Stoics and they would have been agnostics. But he didn't even like the simile of the orchard. You know why? Because he said it makes it too easy to make sound like you can remove things. Like you could take, because logic was the fence. Well, you could potentially take the fence out and still have, the trees and soil, which were the physics, which you obviously can't get rid of, and the fruit, which was the ethics. But he didn't even like that simile because he said it makes it too easy for someone to argue that you can start to pull pieces out of the system and have it remain the same. So,
and it's really interesting. I think the more I read Stoicism, the more I notice that there are some very fundamental attitudes, you might even call them normative attitudes, that the person's required to hold. And if you do, and you follow these attitudes through as sort of conditions for being in the world, they all end up in a providential perspective. So like, for example, one attitude that gets used a lot is to act as if what happens was what I actually wished to happen in the first place, and another attitude is to have the kind of reverence and gratitude that you'd have if life was a festival, dedicated to the gods, for example. Another one I notice is that suffering is largely inevitable, but it's an opportunity to hone character and to develop virtue. And so all of these, when followed through, which you can't seem to remove, especially like the suffering and the whatever they call dichotomy of control, you can't remove those from Stoicism without fundamentally changing it. But if you decide to put them into your life as attitudes and practices, they end up with a very providential perspective of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Ironically, a lot of the same people who recoil at a word like providence, the concept of fate or fortune, will tell you when something bad happens, well, everything happens for a reason, right? Or they'll tell you they see something bad happen to someone else who they know have been bad. Well, that's karma. That's neither one of those concepts comes from atheism, nor does it come from any, materialist mechanistic view. In other words, they carry these ideas because in some sense they believe them to be true. At their very core, people think, well, yeah, things do really happen for a reason. But don't tell me that the universe the cosmos is providentially ordered. I don't want to hear that. Or you find someone and you say, my favorite analogy is, there's a lot of people. In fact, some prominent scientists say there's a 50% probability that the universe is a matrix, is a sim city, right? These are prominent. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson says that 50% probability that we live in a matrix, and people are okay with it. Oh, cool. Neil deGrasse Tyson said that we live in a matrix. All right. Well, let's tear that analogy apart. What is a matrix? Matrix is some kind of intelligent program, right? Well, an intelligent program requires someone to have created it. Now, granted, it might be a far off galaxy and a 14-year-old sitting at his keyboard creating the sim city that we live in. But if it was a 14-year-old in another, galaxy or another universe creating the sim city that we live in, that person has the power to completely control our lives, to destroy this world at any moment, to influence our lives. What would we call that other than that 14-year-old, other than our God, right? So we recoil at the idea that there's some kind of God, but yet we're completely open to the concept of a matrix, and that some kid in a far off, parallel universe has created ours. But anyway, all of that boils down to, I think, again, my mission is to try to get people to understand that the traditional form of Stoicism is compatible with modern thinking, truly modern thinking, not 19th and 20th century science, but 21st century science. And it's just not it's not the science you're going to read about in Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene. It's not the science you're going to read about in Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing. It's not the science you're going to read about from any of the four horsemen of atheism. But they're scientific thinkers nonetheless, who are on the edges of mainstream science, who are challenging the concepts of materialism and reductionism. And I think that probably not that far from now, we may not have as many objections to Stoic ethics as we do today. It might only take another decade or so before we have some breakthroughs. And we only need to point back to, what was it, I can't remember now, maybe it was in the 1950s or 60s that we have the idea of the Big Bang accepted in modern science. Before that, Einstein thought that the universe was eternal, that there was no beginning. And if you would have said at the beginning of the 20th century, well, the Stoics think that there's a beginning to the cosmos, that it started in a big ball of fire and is going to end up in a big ball of fire again someday, people would have mocked you and laughed at you. Well, now they know that that's not the case. They know there was a beginning because science proved there was a beginning in the Big Bang, right?
Yeah.
So science is evolving as well. And ironically, some of the things that are evolving out of science are getting closer and closer to the Stoic conception of the cosmos rather than farther and farther away.
And I guess it's interesting too that, in the modern age, Stoicism seems to be really growing and growing in a healthy fashion. And part of, I guess, if I had a mission, would be starting to come to an idea that maybe it's to help people get acquainted with these voices, like your particular perspective, which I really enjoy hearing about, and other voices, and learning more about it. And I guess, inadvertently, well, obviously on purpose, but without having given it much thought, I'm a promoter of Stoicism. So I guess we could ask, do you think it's important to promote Stoicism? And if so, like, in what ways do you see Stoicism kind of going forward in the future and developing?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole purpose of my blog and my podcast is to promote Stoicism, to promote it and to get it out there for people who are interested in it, so that they can continue to grow along the path. I think that the primary hurdle to Stoicism becoming more, I would say, adopted is community. And we're starting this sense of community online like this, but right now we live in a COVID age where we can't. It's harder in most places in the world, probably more so in your part of the world than in mine, to meet with people face to face. And I think that Stoics are still too few and too far spread out from one another to have face-to-face meetings on a regular basis in their local communities. I know there are some. I met online with the Monterey Stoics out in California. Just a wonderful group of people that get together every Sunday morning. I know I met online with a group of the Berlin Stoics, and again, I think they were all online meeting with me, but still they get together on a regular basis. The Monterey Stoics were all in the same room, which was really, it was wonderful on my end, watching this group of Stoics, interact with one another and interact with me. And I think that's the missing piece for Stoicism, is getting together in actual communities and being able to meet face to face and share lives with one another, so that we can see exactly how Stoicism is being lived out in other people's lives. And hopefully that, with the passing of COVID, it'll open the door to more and more of that.
Yeah, that's really great, Chris. And I find that really inspiring, because that's what we try to do here in Brisbane. We're lucky we meet once a month, and we have a lovely tree we sit in at the park. We sit,
Hmm.
sorry, sit under the tree, and
Yeah.
we've been lucky. The sun's usually, it's usually really good weather and sunny. Um, and you meet people, and we're all at different levels of life and experience and understanding, but you get to see the human being there, and you start to care for one another. And I think that's something that could be lost easily, just having the Facebook communities and so on. And
Mhm.
out of the physical meetups, we've actually put together an online book club group with various people
Oh,
around
great.
Australia specifically. And we've been reading Plato and Aristotle and Boethius and St. Augustine, all sorts of stuff, which has really helped us then to inform our discussions around Stoicism and that whole
Mhm.
context of providence and virtue and things like that. And then we're so fortunate we can get together and physically meet each other and talk about these things as well. Um, I just think it's really wonderful, and I agree with you. And hopefully going forward, like you say, we can have more opportunities to have physical meetups with people. And wouldn't it be great if you could come to Australia sometime and come and visit with the Brisbane Stoics and sit under the tree and have a latte.
I would love that. If I ever make it down there, I will definitely let you know and try to arrange meeting your group. I would love to meet them face to face.
That's wonderful. And thanks so much for your time, Chris. You've just been wonderful, and I feel like I've learned a lot just speaking to you. And hopefully we can have something keep going in the future that we can share with the Brisbane Stoics, and that's great. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd love to chat with them anytime. And if sometime you want to arrange, kind of a group online meeting where they can all jump in and ask me questions, I'm open to that as well. And thank you for this, and look forward to ongoing communications with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just going to stop the recording now.